guest book, for those of you who don't know of its manifesto and its work, we set it up 15 years ago, and it was committed from the word go to the exchange of stories between youth communities in divided countries, divided cultures. And so the motto was, and is still, exchanging stories, changing histories. And it played on the fact that in all Indo-European languages, the word, or almost all, the word for history and story is actually the same. In French, for example, histoire, raconter des histoires, tell me stories, and then faire de l'histoire, to do history. But the same word, Geschichte in German, and so on. So that was kind of an inspiration as to how story narrative can form and inform and transform, and sometimes deform history, and vice versa, the back and forth between the two. And the second sort of inspiration was a narrative exchange with strangers. And the fact that the word for stranger in Latin and many languages, hostis, for instance, is the same root as hostility and hospitality. It can mean a friend or an enemy. And the wager was, and is, how do you, through narrative, turn an enemy, an opponent, another, an alien, into a friend, through narrative imagination, empathy, and risk and daring. And then the third point I would make is that there was a recognition, and the president's work as a poet, as a statesman, as a prose writer, as a speech maker, has testified to this on countless occasions, but that stories and the exchange of stories is not just about exchanging stories of triumph, particularly, say, national stories, or indeed international stories of triumph and glory and victory and pride. That's important too, particularly in the retelling of the foundation of nations and states, but it's also the exchange of stories of woundedness, of suffering, the stories that have been forgotten, the stories of the victims that were never heard. And it's that recognition of how, a story of victory for one people can be a story of a defeat for another, and of humiliation. So I'd like to begin the conversation. The critique of ideology, as Habermas, your friend Habermas, put it, yes, that no story is innocent. No story, no narrative comes from nowhere. There are all kinds of presuppositions of power, and as Edward Said put it, when you talk about narrate, you've got to ask, who has permission to narrate? Who gets the right to narrate? Who is given voice?
Well, that's very much my point, Richard, because why haven't we been speaking about power?
Yes, power is absolutely crucial here. And power invests narrative in all kinds of ways, and when it does, it dissimulates itself as it dominates. So I think the exchange of narrative is not just about some benign, optimistic, utopian exchange of views. It's a recognition that there is this labor of the negative going on in narrativity as well, that as many lies are being told as many truths. So the critical aspect, absolutely indispensable. But I'd like to go from there to the question of how far can you go with narration without explaining things away? And where does one have to stop and say, we must here respect silence?
Well, it's a very good question to put to me, because there were many people who suggested to me that a president should stay silent. And I couldn't begin to tell you the list of subjects upon which people. I found myself asking somebody yesterday the name of the original authors which I read in the 1960s when I was in the United States on the authoritarian personality. Adorno and others was one of them. Where did it come from? And I do think it's worth thinking as well. You mentioned Habermas. His vision of Europe is tragically over, and I so wish him well in his mid-90s as he is now. But he acknowledged himself, I think, that when he was speaking, for example, about the wasteful competition between the sources of the transcendent, is that he was really speaking about European Christianity. And he was therefore limited in relation to that. That was going to crumble anyway. And then also as well, I think a flaw that was shared with the human rights movement of the 1990s is that it was Eurocentric. It is fascinating the number of scholars that I have met recently, only a few, who are aware of all the other, going back from the Code of Hammurabi and the cultures of Africa, Asia, South America, the different remote areas that had in fact codes of right, codes of justice. You can think, for example, notions of the good person among the Barotse, all of these. And yet the assumption, I think very much, in Nisha McSweeney's book on the bogus, that the West. And what is this West? It is, of course, a construction. Are there any people other than white equal people in ancient Athens? Of course it was full of there were slaves and there were others, but also there were people of different races. Now, I found that in relation to, if I want to move a discussion from hostility to hospitality, I must really say, why have I said it has become in danger of becoming an abstraction? I say this because I saw it happen in the subject I worked on most of my life, sociology. The 19th century is the century of Marx and Weber and Durkheim and so on. And we remember, even at that time of teaching for young sociology students, they used to teach a module called socialization, of how you got society into the young students and so on. It was all based on 6 major studies built around Princeton, Gabriel Armand, Lucian Pye, people like that. The idea is that modernity was what? Being defined in a linear way, ethnocentric way, in a way that it kind of constructed notions of the modern versus the traditional, the urban versus the agricultural, and that it was all, and we went to the United States, people like Orlando Falls-Boda, myself and others, to realize how our societies were backward but could be changed if certain things could be removed. And that's immediately, if there are other people who criticize Michael Higgins would mean to say, but haven't we come a long way? Oh yes, we have come a long way by avoiding some fundamental issues of the relationship between economy, social justice, human rights, ecology. And who today are making these arguments, even at the General Assembly? All the strong places those strong speeches on those issues are coming from what Europe calls the South. But Europe is unable to, in fact, talk about the South in a way that encourages any dialogue, because it has not addressed its own history in relation to its imperialism, colonization, subjugation of cultures, wiping out. Like in May, I said we must address the founding of our own state, the founding of the War of Independence. I have repeatedly suggested this, that the best way of having a conversation with the problems facing Africa is to face history. So how did this happen as well? I mentioned the big figures. I now see how Max Weber is the one I neglected possibly, because mixed with an uncritical new form of capitalism with its new kind of degradations is the rise of a technocracy. So therefore, within that alliance of technocracy and unaccountable capital, you get the latest, which is a kind of taking off the mask and saying the kind of things that were said at the United Nations General Assembly. And that people immediately then in relation, how have people handled this historically? Well, it's to our great credit and why we have democracy, is in fact the people said we're not accepting it. But how do you deal with the kind of numbness that says, I have a way of making anyone who objects impoverished, We are all locked into a motif that suggests that trade is more important than life or rights. And if you sit there and say that, then one is acquiescing. No more than, for example, both of us are scholars who have dealt with the concept of memory. How, you might say, if you were a German at the moment, if you were living in Germany, was it a good idea to say that every child ever born in Germany again will be told the story of God? They should, of course, but are you to say to them that you're to do so without the necessary warning as to numbing you to it ever happening again? Look at Primo Levi's statement, for example, as he said, so that it may never happen again. But yet, at the same time, there are countries in Europe, they're not necessarily, sometimes they're not representative of their populations, who refuse to see anything wrong with genocide, to use the word, in fact, to look at, for example, emaciated children, mothers feeding children deprived of water and so forth. And this raises the other thing, which I think comes out of this book, which was, I was looking at it again last night, which is a very good book, but it's, who is it that has the situation? It's Kant, actually, Immanuel Kant, that makes the phrase that dignity is not a condescension, but dignity is a right. Well, now, if the Palestinian people, for example, have the rights to independence that other people enjoyed after the First World War, how can you say that their right must be negotiated with the people who are responsible for overreaction? I have immediately to say, I have condemned again and again the actions of October the 7th, but that's not where history, the long history is in relation to whether you accept it as a right or not. People say that so-and-so is going to issue a statement, somebody else is going to issue a statement. The fact of the matter, when I look at the McMahon correspondence with Hussein, for example, at the foundation of the State of Israel, with a set of conditions attached and the rest of it, one of the things that they are, 80% of the population at the moment on the ground, farming, some are Bedouins, some are others, are in fact actually what they're less than 20% are people of Jewish faith. How are we to describe them? The British protectorate says we'll just say non-Jewish. So you call the 80% non-Jewish. And you then, to this day, as I have had experience in good Gaza and the West Bank and so on, where I found it difficult to have good people who were having a change that might have moved from hostility to hospitality. And they cannot say the word Palestinian. They say no. That you're talking about Judea and Samaria and so forth. So what are you to do when you have come to a point? I'm only describing it as the depth of the challenge. Is we have come to this point of so many comprehensive evasions that I think that you can say many things about Kant doing. But one of the things that my very first speeches, when I quoted those speeches, the assumption was of a universal order, of a universality that could accommodate and include all of this diversity I describe, be it in terms of gender and culture and so forth. And then as I come on in many ways, see, I watched what happened after the 19th century concentration on Marxism, anti-Marxism, in relation to macro theory, shifting into micro theory, and in its most useless form, assisted by, I think, postmodernism, something called ethnomethodology within micros. And what it all was fiddling with what it is safe, as one avoided is, in fact, the exercise and distribution of power. And that now is made manifest in relation to the question of, the whole question about, yes, there is capacity. You hear the moment, which is universalism at its best, when you have the Universal Development Goals, commitment to new forms of agriculture, production, consumption, and so on. You can actually feel, I did, and I was glad to have been president in that period, when there was a kind of a sense of hope. But there is so much the scholarship in many. Look at where you were where you will return to the United States, which is witnessing the destruction of its universities. You have equally in the case of in the United Kingdom next door, You've just luckily a judge has struck down the definition of terrorism. You equally in relation to other areas. Think of the important words. Freedom. It is not freedom from hunger we speak of now. It is not freedom to have access to different cultures, not freedom of movement. No, the point is to ensure our freedom. We must deepen our scarcities on the most vulnerable so that we can, in fact, be more lethal. And remember Huntington, that I told you he's still on the road, what Huntington's remarks were. In order to be free, you must know who the opponent is. And thus, and then that. And that it has to be faced and addressed.
Absolutely. This Sevo indignatio comes to mind as I hear you. And you're a descendant of Swift in your savage indignation about these injustices that are being committed and have been committed for so long. In terms of narrative hospitality, you have, in your speeches, in your teachings, as you've just spoken now, in your many collections of essays and prose works, I made a little list earlier, Power to the People, When Ideas Matter, Causes for Concern, Restoring the European Street, remember that one?
Yeah.
Reviewing the Republic. You have written so powerfully in prose, telling stories and challenging stories of power, and done it so remarkably well, giving us all an example of moral leadership and moral imagination. And then there's another kind of language, another kind of storytelling, which you have also engaged in and excelled in, and that's a different kind of power. It's maybe the power of the powerless, because if narratives in prose tell history as it happened, as it actually happened, narratives in poetry tell it as if it happened, or in fiction, as if it happened in this way or that way. And I'm very interested in seeing how your prose work as a critique of power links, if it does, and this is my question to you, with your poetry. In your new and selected poems, in your new spoken poetry project, where there's a different kind of power at work, isn't there? The power of the powerless. And I'd like to ask you about that.
I often see in the poetry I read and in the attempts I make, my own writing and the rest of it, I am actually struggling with images that are not contemporary, and narrative is a difficult word to put it because recalled events and also the experiences and so on are going to surface in your life in different ways, sometimes in terms of near despair and depression and so forth. I would say that across the disciplines that I know and the scholars whose work I've read, and I thought, curiously, it was in Palestine I met the woman who had done the big study. And she had said, children in Palestine, it was after the building of the dividing wall, which of course the International Court has condemned. And she said, children are so affected by the humiliation of their parents that it is affecting them later in traumatic terms more than the death of either parent. Of course, we now have to come where you have so many people with no adult at all looking after them, and you have 42,000 amputees in Gaza and so forth. It will get worse. But sticking to my point about memory, I think that is the very interesting thing about poetry. In many ways has a sensibility that is not limited to what is a conventional narrative. So there is such a thing as the poetic instinct. But then there's also a different thing in relation to the crafting and the making of the poem, which is affected by, again, different circumstances. And I think that when that is happening, it is about the allowing of what I call the agoniste, the agony of existence and contradiction, to find its expression in different ways. Many of the art forms, I think, for example, in relation to contemporary dance, in relation to different forms of theatre. This is different forms indeed of theatre, and the Stanislavski myth and others can do. So it's a matter of this. And then if you are inevitably going to have to face the fundamental questions then about the location of that confused life in the long version of time. And when I speak about, therefore, I immediately move into then to a consideration of the concept of transcendence. And if you actually try and deal with the concept of transcendence in a full anthropological way, in an adequate ethical way, you're then immediately, you might, as I would say in many cases, may all prophets be listened to, but may they speak of peace. But yet it is something that I'm back now very nearly to where Habermas didn't go. And I think Derrida has it in another piece of his work. If you're to judge what are the consequences of these systems of transcendence in different ways, is that there weren't, just as I described it, there were attempts to be singular powers. So it would have been a very good beginning. You asked me about my poem. When I wrote my poem, for example, The Prophets Are Weeping, I meant very deliberately what I think was influenced me in writing that particular time was all the atrocities in the names of founding figures of so-called spirituality and so forth, and what had been delivered. And it would be my advice to the Pope at present in many ways, that it call a meeting of the heads of these doctrinal systems to say we acknowledge the horror that has been done in the way of imposed absolutisms of transcendence and belief. About the poems too, in many ways, it was when sometimes I have lost many poems because sometimes they come to me at night and I don't get up and write them. I will cover a fragment of them the following day. And it's hoping I intend to go back to there. I have some unfinished projects that are good. But it is a very, there's a last point I'll make about it is in relation to the concept of the sacral.
Yes. In
many cases, recently I've been writing a bit just for myself about this. Is that I think it is. He's now a professor in Berkeley, but I remember him writing about this. What happens when a person says they're encountering the sacral, and in terms they have a sense of awe? Well, the awe requires a kind of a penumbra of mysterium around the source of the awe, and if you go too close, the mysterium disappears, and it is no longer for you a source of awe. In many ways, it is interesting too, is that I think the more some gerontologists would say, very even late in life in many cases, people have different strategies of addressing this. For example, a person would say, near death would say, I'll travel now. And they begin, in fact, to have encounters through the past that they had in different ways and so forth. But that then is in relation to what are you suggesting? Are you suggesting an animate notion that is continuing past physical life? Very many writers and creators, in fact, draw on that strength, as it were, about that nothing is ever forgotten truly, and therefore, in fact, so far as it is left by way of being there, by way of recall. Hence, you'll notice in symbolism in the creative arts of leaving a stone on stone and so on. Yeah.
So I'm very grateful to you, and I'm sure we all are very grateful to you for always speaking in those two voices and bearing witness to those two voices of the political on the one hand and the poetic on the other, so eloquently and so courageously.
Thank you, Richard, very much.